Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's Yale Club of Taipei presentation at the American Club in Taipei. Welcome to our friends in Singapore, Grand Rapids, Shanghai, and other places as well. Tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a favorite friend of mine who is the speaker, Professor William Reinfeld, who I met in 1989 upon my arrival in Taiwan. He was heading an organization here, a very famous consulting company based out of Boston, but he was anchoring the team in Taipei. It was called Arthur D. Little. And Arthur D. Little, for those of you who do not know, was instrumental in the contribution it made to creating the process that led to the industrialization and modernization of Taiwan, often referred to as the Taiwan miracle. The first time it was referred to as the Taiwan miracle was a scholar, a professor called Thomas Gold, who focuses on Taiwan. He's based in Berkeley, and he still comes to Taiwan quite often. Bill has been, for many years, based in Taipei, and he has had an illustrious career at Arthur D. Little, and then subsequently at Anderson Consulting. And he has been a professor at Zhengda University here in Taipei, and also more recently at NYU in Shanghai. His alma maters are Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh and a small school in New Haven called Yale. And many years ago, I had the pleasure of hearing the story, or in bits and pieces, of his involvement and that of many others whose names you will hear for the first time today, who were involved with teaming with Mr. K.T. Lee, who was trained as a physicist, but was in many ways empowered by the government, the leader here. And he was the one who organized the efforts to bring many, many professionals and stakeholders into a process which became what is today Taiwan, which is what we enjoy. And why these remarks are so important is, one, to record them and to acknowledge what these lightsaber carrying people did, but also for us to contemplate why it's not happening on a daily basis here in Taiwan going forward. And as many people around Bill, especially his wife, says, these are old stories. What's important, of course, you never disagree with the wife, is how it's relevant to today. So I'm hoping at the end, Bill will share his thoughts on that, and we'll open up to Q&A. Bill's comments will be around 40 minutes long. And I thank Bill, who spends most of his time now in the Boston area, for coming and agreeing to share his amazing experiences with a room full of people who have been the beneficiaries of his wisdom and hard work. Thank you. Would you please help me to welcome William Reinfeld?
Thank you very much, Nick, for those kind words. And thank you for inviting me to come here this evening and give you some perspectives on this so-called Taiwan economic miracle. It's a great honor for me, and it's a very wonderful experience to try and recount what happened from the time Taiwan started this journey until today. And in some ways, one could say the miracle is still proceeding. The challenges are new and so on. So it got me thinking about things. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of the material that I had collected years ago to help me with this. So a lot of this is from memory, and a lot of it has to do with things that are my own personal perspectives on what happened. So I'm going to try and quickly include some of the history of this period, but then try and focus on what were the important factors that led to this miracle, as we refer to it. So we all know that about this so-called economic miracle, which is very evident today when we consider where Taiwan was, when the Japanese left here in the early 1950s, and when we think about the tremendous progress, not just economically, but in terms of world reputation for some of the key high-tech industries, semiconductors and others. So how did Taiwan get to this stage from the position of a small, resource-poor, formerly colonized agricultural economy in the 1950s? As I look around the room, I see most of you people probably did not really enter the business world or even the academic world during the early years of this miracle. And so everyone in this room, as well as elsewhere, has their own perspective on this, depending on when and where you grew up, your professional and political background and inclinations, and your exposure to Taiwan's industry and other factors. So this evening, I'm going to give you my perspectives, which stem from my training at Yale, where I got a PhD, a master's and PhD in economics, and then my other exposure of when it started here in Taiwan in the late 1960s and early 1970s. After I got my PhD at Yale, I went to work for Arthur D. Little, and one of the early assignments that they gave me was to work at the Asian Development Bank in Manila. This was in the late 1960s, and when we finished that project, we came to Taiwan in early 1970s, and I'll get into how that happened. But at that point, KT Lee and others were looking for consultants to help Taiwan with their economic development. And during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, I was here either as a resident or visiting consultant, working with the government and the private sector in accomplishing all these wonderful things that happened. So that's my perspective. So why is this an important subject? Well, it's important, obviously, for intellectual purposes and a little insights into history, but it's even more important because those of you who are from Taiwan and work here need to understand what it is that's so special for Taiwan and why Taiwan was able to accomplish all these great things that we all know happened here, and what we can learn from it and what implications this has in going forward, because you can't duplicate things that happen, but you can understand what were the important underlying factors, and maybe those can be then utilized in continuing to deal with the challenges that Taiwan faces today. It reminds me a little bit, as I was thinking about it, of the situation of when you were growing up, and even as adults, you read biographies of heroes and big people, famous people who were great athletes or scientists or politicians or war heroes, and you read their biography and learn what it is that made them successful. And in a way, the study of the history of Taiwan's economic miracle is in fact a way to identify those things and dealing going forward. So what are my thoughts as to what are the principal factors? So now I'm going to list those principal factors. And I have to say at the beginning that these are, again, my perspectives. And if you ask anyone else, everyone has a different perspective on what were the key factors, not just what they were, but their priorities and their rankings. So I'm not ranking these, although I list them in numerically, but they're not meant to be or in order of importance. And so what I'll do is list those right now very quickly, then go through a brief history of the so-called economic miracle, because the history is important in understanding and identifying some of the touch points of this journey. So I'll try and go through that quickly so that I can return to the 7 points that I'm going to introduce you to now as to what these factors were. So the first factor that I'm mentioning, again, it's not necessarily the most important, are that this miracle started with some favorable conditions at the beginning in the early 1950s, and I'll get into those later. Secondly, I would say that there was little political and environmental or social considerations in making the decisions along this journey. And that's a very important point, and I will get to that later again. Third are the outstanding people that were involved in this mapping and leading the journey. Fourth are the effective institutions, many institutions that I'll mention. And of course, I probably will neglect to mention others, but I can only touch on the ones that came to my mind. And important policies to support these decisions. A public-private sector partnership. All along this journey, the government and the private sector were close in touch with each other, separate but cooperating. And that partnership played an important role in the success of Taiwan's economy. Then there were dozens of important initiatives that the government took, investments and policies and so on that made this happen. And finally, there was a considerable inflow of foreign capital and technology. So I will return to these, but very quickly, in order to really understand these factors, I have to run through a brief history. Again, this is from my perspective. Other people might give a different order or different view as to what were these different stages. This is my own interpretation. So I divided this into 4 stages. The first one is the early introduction and birth of the so-called miracle after the Japanese pulled out, in the next 12 years as to setting the groundwork for for some emergence that took place in the second period. And then the third stage is when really the takeoff of this miracle took place, and that was when I actually got involved. And this was the most impactful period for what people generally think of now as the miracle. And then finally, it reached a stage after the mid-1980s of modernization, which is sort of, maybe there's a 5th stage that we're in now, but I'm going to go quickly through each of these, spend a little more time on the 3rd stage and glide over the others so that I can return to the factors. But I think it's important to have this background and history, because as I look around, as I said, many of you weren't around for this. So I'm going to introduce you to institutions and policies and initiatives that maybe you haven't heard about before. And of course, I think you should learn more about it after we after this introduction. Oh, I'm sorry. So for each of these stages, I'm going to give you a brief description of what the situation was at the beginning or during this stage, what the situation was, what the challenges were, and what the major actions were in each stage. So the first stage, as I said, was during the 1950s, the early period of when the foundations of this miracle sort of were laid. Taiwan was largely an agricultural economy with a per capita income of less than $100 per year in the early 1950s. It was mostly agricultural, and most of the non-agricultural contribution was from state-owned enterprises who were in fertilizer, tobacco, chemicals, utilities, etc. There was no heavy industry. There was mainly light industry, mainly small businesses, fairly well dispersed, and the Japanese had kept the Taiwan from developing major industry. Even they didn't want the Taiwan to develop food-related industries. So the main thing of interest of the Japanese was developing a good agricultural sector. To the extent there were small businesses, or privately owned businesses, they were largely family owned. And there were a few larger ones like Formosa Plastics, Tatung, and Far Eastern, but most of them were very, very small businesses. And when the Japanese left, they left behind a fairly good basic infrastructure in terms of rural roads, trains, narrow gauge trains that ran to the ports, and electrification. All of this was mainly for the support of the agricultural sector and not any real industrial sector. And there was also during this time a pretty major commitment by the United States to help Taiwan with funding and with advisors. So the foreign exchange senior economic advisors came to help Taiwan with the new challenges of this period. And during this period, the economic growth was quite good. It was anywhere from for those 12 years from 4.6% per annum to 8.2%. So what were the major challenges? Price stability and import substitution. So they had to get the economy on stable and to reduce imports because there was no local industry to supply the consumers here other than food. Also, a challenge was to start to take care of some of the social overhead capital that had been neglected, other than the roads and rail and electrification. So the challenge was to pursue economic rather than social goals, principally focusing on productivity and achieving a balance between the rural and urban development and coordination in public sector planning. Absorbing the rural labor force because as the farmers there was land reform, and as farmers were made available for the labor force, you had to absorb them, but you didn't want to absorb them into the cities. You wanted to make sure that the farmers were dispersed along the whole, primarily the West Coast, so that they could be employed and produce the things that were lacking. So what were some of the major actions at this time? As I said, technical and financial support from the USAID And JCRR, the Joint Commission for Rural Reconstruction. This was an important institution that was actually brought from the mainland in 1949. JCRR had originated in the mainland, was brought to Taiwan by the Americans to now assist Taiwan with their agricultural sector, but also in general, building up a sound agricultural sector so that less people had to work on the farms, that the farms were more efficient, and that the labor force could be integrated into becoming part of the productive industry. And then at that time, during this period, Taiwan launched their 4-year economic development plans, which were very critical and very important in the development of Taiwan. And I'll get back to this later because I think that these economic development plans, 4-year and then later 6-year development plans, played a major role in identifying sound projects and policies and strategies for supporting these policies. So now we go to the second stage of this journey, which started in 1962, 63, and then went on to 1973. At this point, the work that had been done in stage 1 was starting to take effect, and the economy was growing more rapidly, over 10% a year. So it was quite a healthy economy. There was vigorous capital formation, some of it from external sources, but most of it domestic, because the savings rate was very high here, and capital was accessible from people earning money but not spending it, saving it, and then investing it. There was rapid export growth, particularly in industrial products, and a decline, as I said, in consumption down to in the high 60s. So that's a low percentage of income going to consumption, and a very high rate of savings, which made capital available for investment. The major industries at that time were the food processing, textiles, telecoms, and machinery. No real high-tech industries. And by the late 1960s, this labor force had been absorbed into the industrial sector, and there was no longer a labor surplus. So what were the challenges? Well, it was at the same time a worldwide recession, and at this time also in 1963, U.S. stopped providing funding. However, they did allow the Taiwan to retain whatever loans America had made, and it amounted to quite a bit of money in terms of, in those days, in 1963, it was the equivalent to $15 billion that they made available to Taiwan to do the kinds of studies and infrastructure projects that were being identified. During this period, they recognized that there was an over-reliance of low-valued industries. Infrastructure needed support. Access to foreign capital and technology were still very, very much needed, and so on. So these were the major challenges during stage 2. So what actions were taken? Well, the government now was getting more involved in overall planning. They realized that planning was an important function of that the economy needed overall planning as a way to achieve some major objective and to overcome these challenges and to provide a balanced growth between agriculture and industry. Also, during this period, major focus was placed to no longer focus on import substitution, because they've done a pretty decent job in those previous 12 years in providing the goods and services that were being imported, but now recognizing that they needed to develop the export sector. So they began focusing on capital-intensive industries instead of labor-intensive industries. And they developed export processing zones, which were very important during this time and still are, where the semi-finished goods or raw materials are imported into a zone that where no duties have to be paid, but then they can be processed and exported and not have to pay duty. And so that became a very powerful institution or model for Taiwan's industrialization during this period. And they also developed industrial estates during this period, about 17 of them by 1966. And now we come to the third stage, which, as I said, I think is the most important one for this whole development of the miracle, and the one where I got involved in it. So what was the situation? Manufacturing now contributed 90% of the GDP. Half of it was from light industry and half of it was heavy industry. So it was still pretty heavily focused on light industry, but much more important. Previous to this, the manufacturing sector, in the 1950s was negligible, and now it was contributing 90% of the GDP. There were very strong competitive factors at this time. Taiwan had a hardworking, decent labor force. It had developed industrial land and some basic infrastructure. However, it still faced increased competition from other Southeast Asian countries and other parts of the world, particularly in light and medium-sized industries. And other countries had much more labor than Taiwan and cheaper labor. So Taiwan really had a lot of competition, was facing a lot of competition in these light labor-intensive industries that had been so important in the previous period. There were also beginning to emerge strained international relations with regard to PRC and their growing influence in the rest of the world. So what were the major challenges in this period? Well, it was to find new directions for industrial development, shifting from low value to higher value added products, developing the private sector so there was not as much reliance on these state-owned enterprises and government-funded industries, less protection to encourage the private sector to become more productive and more active, acquisition of foreign technology and capital, and modernization of small and obsolete industries. So Taiwan at this time was recognizing they had done a pretty decent job for the last 20 years in getting started with this journey, but now it was time to really get into high gear and modernize or develop the new economy. So one of the other challenges then was how to create an environment to encourage and support these new initiatives, and finding foreign investors who would provide capital and technology, because Taiwan recognized as a small country, they had a lot, they needed to have a lot of imported capital and new technology to make up for their deficiency, and develop manpower and greater selectivity, being more selective, because they had such a big large number of things that they had to do. They had to figure out which steps they should take, which industries, which products, and so on. And they had limited resources, so they had to become more selective. And they also had to begin doing more industry-focused R&D. So what did they do? So the first thing is that K.T. Lee Guoting, hired Arthur D. Little in 1972 to come to Taiwan and help them with a national industrial development guidelines and opportunities. So how did this happen? Well, Li Guoting at that time was the Minister of Finance, and he and the other technocrats and leaders in the country recognized they needed outside support for this because they really wanted to make a major change in the trajectory they were on, the path that they were on. So he went to MIT in Boston and wanted to talk to see if MIT could help Taiwan with this new outlook for Taiwan's industry. And at MIT, he was told that they don't do this kind of consulting work, but down the street is Arthur D. Little, which happened to be a spinoff. Arthur D. Little was a spinoff of MIT, and at that time was one of the largest and most successful consulting firms in the world. And it was right near MIT and related to it. So Li Guoting went to down the street to MIT and talked to the people there. And they said, oh, we have a group of consultants who are just finishing up at the Asian Development Bank in the Philippines. Their assignment there is just about done. We'll have them go to Taiwan to meet you and discuss this. So I happened to be on this small team that was seconded to the Asian Development Bank for those few years, and our work was finished. So we went over to visit Taiwan and to visit with K.T. Lee and some others who I'm going to mention in a moment. And they were very direct and very forthcoming in terms of what was needed and what they were looking for. And Arthur D. Little was perfect because Arthur D. Little at that time was a technology consulting firm, industry specialists. They were not the McKinsey type strategy business boardroom consultants. They were most of the people at Arthur D. Little had engineering degrees from MIT or other top technical schools with business degrees. And so they were very well oriented towards helping exactly what K.T. Lee was looking for, not just in terms of their background, but in terms of their orientation and so on. They were not your typical MBA boardroom consultants. So we came out there and we spent a week to identify what was needed. We wrote a proposal while we were here, and within a week, they hired us for a major study. I mean, it was just unheard of that we would get such a great assignment in such a short period of time, but they were in a hurry. They were not going to go around looking for other consultants and other proposals and having committees to vote on it and interviews and so on. There was no time. They hired us just like that. And so we deposited a group of, so we were dealing with, at that point, CIECD, the Council for Economic Industry and Development. And the clients were Fang-Jing Guo, K.T. Lee, Elias Sun, and Walter Fay. And this became the steering committee. They made a decision on the spot, and they said, we want you to do, we worked out a work program and agreed that they would meet with us regularly and supervise our work. The Council for International Economic Cooperation and Development were the executing agency. And we stationed a small core team here, primarily economists and planners. And then we brought in the industry specialists to do the various studies. They weren't in residence here, but they came out for a couple of months at a time, several times during this period and so on. And after the 2-year, anytime we made a recommendation along the way, the decisions were reached right away. We met, maybe twice a month with this group, and they asked intelligent questions, and they were really involved in it, and they got along very well with the technical people that we had brought out. So just very briefly, what we came up with was a 13-volume report for dealing with 4 sectors, primarily petrochemicals, electric machinery and equipment, non-electrical machinery, policies, and guidelines for selecting these high priority industries. We also then identified specific opportunities in each of these industries. And afterwards, after we finished that part of the program, we actually worked with the companies and people responsible in Taiwan to introduce them to potential investors. So we helped them promote these projects. During this period, Taiwan also launched two more development plans in 1973 to 76, and then they switched to a 6-year development plan. And as I said again, these plans were very, very significant in terms of what they identified in terms of projects and creating a better environment for investors to act on these opportunities. During this time, also, ITRI was established, and I think ITRI is a very critical part in this whole story, because ITRI, which was initiated by Y.S. Sun in 1973 to do R&D for priority sectors, chemicals, electronics, food and beverage, etc. The R&D that grew out of this institution, which now I think, or at least the last time I knew, had over 6,000 engineers and scientists. And the research that they do is very much industry focused and supported by financial support, loans and so on, and spins off industries, sets up incubator operations, and then eventually helps them to be privatized and so on. And so, for example, TSMC and UMC are both spin-offs from the type of thing that ITRI did and still does do. But in the early days, this was critical to Taiwan's success. And also at that time, again, this came from one of our recommendations. They developed the Hsinchu Science Park. Originally, it was a concept initiated by Zhang Jingguo, but then it was further promoted by Professor Xu Xiansu, who was the president of Tsinghua, Minister of Science and Technology, and the first Director General of ITRI. He was also very critical in developing this concept of the science park. And then we worked with Irving Ho, who was the developer and the first director of Hsinchu Park. And of course, KTE was involved, and Arthur D. Little, again, was very active in doing some of the early planning and finding, setting up programs within Hsinchu that would make it a very productive, well-rounded science park. And its success is known now throughout the world. As a matter of fact, one thing I would like to point out, which is one reason why I consider this whole discussion of being such a great importance, is after the 1970s, when I was working here, as an international development economist, I had assignments throughout the world, in developing parts of the world. And everywhere I worked, I used the model of Taiwan, Science Park, ITRI, the planning things as models for development in third world or developing countries. So the experience that we had here became a model that we were hired by other countries to help them with their development program because of the great success and the fact that everything we recommended was acted upon. So also at this time, CITRA was started. CITRA was the China External Trade Council. It was actually started in the early 1970s, but it changed its name so that it wouldn't be associated with mainland China. It's now called TITRA. And it still exists, but it was very significant. I don't know how active it is now, but I can tell you that in the 70s, it was very active when they set up all kinds of promotion programs, and they really did a fantastic job in getting Taiwan's tremendous export sector going. And III was founded during this time. And that was very important institute for the information industries, and it was initiated by K.T. Lee and also grew out of a recommendation that we had made. And then finally, the construction plans, projects. I mean, there were the famous 10 major construction projects that were initiated by Chen in the mid-1970s. And then the so-called 12 new development projects. So it was a tremendous investment in infrastructure to support the development initiatives. Then we come to the stage 4, which I'll go through very quickly because I really don't think it was a part of the economic miracle that people are talking about. I mean, it's a continuation of this miracle, but it wasn't the really active part of it. And it was, you know, at this point in the mid-1980s, Taiwan, you know, the factors of production were now very sophisticated and much better known. There were new global competition that Taiwan had to engage with, dramatic technological changes, greater global competition, and so on. So Taiwan, again, the challenge was, again, looking for higher value industries. That's always been, you know, the challenge for Taiwan. How do you elevate, because of the scarce resources that Taiwan has, how do you take what Taiwan has in terms of labor, capital, land, and add greater value? You can't expand very much more, but you can do what you're doing with greater value of input. So that's what they're constantly looking for, how to elevate the value added. Economic priorities changed. Again, now they started thinking more about some of the social overhead capital that had been neglected, you might say, as people became more prosperous and so on. A new form of new challenges and configurations in global competition. And at this point, they started talking about regional centers. I never really liked that idea because I think it was a bit overextended in terms of Taiwan's capabilities, but Taiwan wanted to become the regional center for finance, for heavy metals, for every conceivable sector. Taiwan wanted to be the regional center. I think it was a little bit of a mistake. And I think actually in the modernization period, there were a lot of mistaken steps and objectives. And part of it was because at this time, Taiwan was also trying to underplay or lessen the importance of the central planning. And I think the planners were not as careful as they were during the earlier period that I'm talking about, and so on. So there was less public sector involvement, more private sector initiatives, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. That was a big part of this period. And finding, again, foreign investors and strengthening R&D. So what actions were taken? Again, by this time, Arthur D. Little had set up an office here. I was running it. And we immediately, as soon as we opened an office here, we got a project with the Ministry of Economic Affairs to do Taiwan to 2000. It was supposed to be a duplicate of what we had done back in the early 70s. And however, interestingly, this new study now, focused on advanced materials, consumer electronics, IT, automation systems, precision equipment, et cetera, as opposed to the more basic industries that we focused on in the 70s. So again, it was a major study. It lasted 2 years. It covered specific opportunities and strategies. And we assisted Taiwan in finding investors and establishing cross-border strategic alliances. There was a new 6-year plan, again, focusing on these regional centers and privatization of state-owned enterprises. So that was a little quick journey through these 4 stages, but at least it allows me now to go back to these principles these factors that I think really represent the reasons why Taiwan was able to undertake this journey so successfully. And again, as I said, these are not necessarily in order of priority. Someone else might have different factors that they might say. Some of these are clusters of factors. I spoke to someone in preparation of these charts and asked them what they thought were the major factors. And it was very interesting because this person had entered the workforce in Taiwan in the early 1980s and didn't really was growing up during the early years of this miracle. And this person said that their parents always said that the major factor behind the success of Taiwan during this economic miracle was the hardworking people here. And, you can't deny that that was one of the factors, but I don't mention that specifically, but I say the people who were involved. So what I'm saying is that each one of us has a different set of perspectives as to what were the factors and what were the most important ones. So let me, go through these now a little more. So the first was the favorable conditions at the starting point, which I've already mentioned. And there was how poor Taiwan was, but they were able to capitalize on what they had. So they had a fairly good basic infrastructure. The diaspora, which resulted from the communist takeover of the mainland, brought a cadre of trained, experienced, and educated bureaucrats, business industry leaders, and military personnel to Taiwan. This was an important factor because had they not come here to Taiwan, it would have been a difficult journey for Taiwan to start. So those people that came from the mainland were able to provide some of the leadership and technical background that Taiwan lacked. These transplants, together with the indigenous population, constituted a disciplined, industrious labor pool willing to work hard and make sacrifices. So some might say that this is the most important thing, but this would not have happened without the other things. So all of these factors are important, but this is one that I think everyone would agree on was a necessary but not sufficient factor. And of course, again, the inflow of capital and technology from US aid, as I said, it was the equivalent of about $15 billion in 1963 when the US stopped providing the aid, but allowing Taiwan to use the funds that they had for further development. And then the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, they provided not only funds, but advisory services, including the land reform program and allowing farmers to, have more productive farms so that some of them could go into the workforce. Second, very important factor is the fact that little politics political, environmental, or social considerations were used in making the decisions. This is very important. This is a very critical factor that allowed the technocrats to make good decisions, quick decisions, and decisions that were based and directed to the best interests of Taiwan. Although Taiwan is now one of the world's exemplary two-party democracies, in the early years of the economic development journey, the decision makers were not constrained by having to consider opposing political views or implications for re-election. This was a very important factor. Likewise, they had to pay only modest attention to environmental and social considerations. I can tell you, when we made a recommendation to KT Lee and Chen and the others over those years, yeah, they said, well, are there, try and minimize the negative effects these projects or policies would have on the environment and on social objectives, but they were not going to stop Taiwan from making these decisions. Fortunately, these decision makers during this period were benevolent and used sound macroeconomic development objectives in determining the priorities and reaching their decisions. Third, the outstanding people involved in mapping and leading the journey. These were, as I've mentioned, strong, experienced, well-trained, capable, and dedicated leaders. And particularly important was that they were decisive. They made decisions like on the spot. And this was, as I mentioned throughout, very important in getting things done and moving right away. I've mentioned some specific names throughout this presentation so far, but let me focus on some of the ones that really stand out in my mind. As I said, a lot of my notes are back in the United States. I didn't have access to them. So a lot of this is from my impression. I probably have left out a lot of important people, but these are nevertheless important people. Chang Ching-kuo, of course, was a very important person in this journey of the economic miracle. He was the head of, he was the vice premier and head of CIECD, the original planning council. He was premier and then president. Li Guoting, well, everyone knows about him. He was a physicist. As a matter of fact, all of these people were either physicists or either scientists or engineers. There were no lawyers. There were no business people. They were all sound technical people. Pardon me?
Look what happened.
Yeah. So it's an interesting side note, but it explains a little bit how they made their decisions, how they analyzed them, and how they reached the decisions that they made. Y.S. Sun was extremely important, and Walter Fay was a very important person and Minister of Finance and so on. Also important during this period were some of the outstanding industry pioneers, I call them. Again, this list can be very long, but two that come to my mind because I worked closely with them I had a chance to work with them and see what outstanding people they were in terms of their understanding of the economy, understanding their technology, and understanding how to make things happen. Of course, Morris Chang, everyone knows. Morris actually had come to Taiwan back in the 1960s when he was with TI to set up a joint project here in semiconductors, and then continued coming out here until he was recruited by KT Lee and Y.S. Sun from General Instruments, where he left, where he'd gone to after he left TI, to head up ITRI. So he headed up ITRI and there founded developed the concept of TSMC and then later spun it off. Stan Shi was very instrumental in developing the whole computer industry in Taiwan. He started Multitech in '76, which later became Acer. Also important at this time, during this period, were the advisors. Advisors that the government turned to because they recognized they needed outside assistance and they needed people they could trust who not only knew technology and new industries, but also knew Taiwan. And of course, Yale, one of the reasons we're here this evening is because Yale did play an important part here. Yale professors that I knew and were very committed to studying Taiwan and helping with their advice to Taiwan were Gus Reynos, John C. Fay, and Samuel Ho. These were very, very outstanding economists at Yale and very committed, highly committed to Taiwan's economic development. There were also advisors to the government here that were brought in largely by USAID, who were stationed here and paid for by the US government, but came to all the top meetings. They were in daily contact with the ministers and the decision makers. And two of them that I met and I thought were really outstanding were Joseph Moore, who for many years was an advisor to MOEA, and Bruce Billings, who was a longtime senior advisor and as a commissioner to the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction. And then there was a group of people called, that I call Overseas Taiwanese Advisors. I can't remember exactly what their official title was, but they were Taiwan, largely, primarily engineers who had left Taiwan in the 60s and 70s, or in the 60s mostly, studied in the United States, and then eventually went to work in the United States, but still were committed to Taiwan. And Taiwan officially brought them back periodically as advisors to the government. They listened to these people. As a matter of fact, when we did our study back in the 70s, we had to meet with these people every 2 or 3 months to defend they were part of the steering committee, these advisors who were Taiwanese, but coming from the United States to look what we're doing, to see where they had to make some adjustments so that it would better fit Taiwan. And our engineers spoke their language, so it was a terrific interchange. So again, and then another group were the consulting firms. I've already mentioned Arthur D. Little, so I won't go over it. But in 1986, we opened an office here and then closed it in 2000. And I won't go into that. That's another lecture as to why Arthur D. Little closed. Was actually went under. Now it's been revitalized. But but in that period that we've just covered, we performed over 100 engagements for the government, the private sector, and multinationals. And a number of Yalees working for Arthur D. Little were heavily involved during this period. There was Bill Krebs, who was my mentor, was a Yale undergrad and law school. Myself, a very good friend of mine, Wilfred Welch, and Tim Leong, who worked for Arthur D. Little and then McKinsey, and played an important part in many of these projects. And then there were other consulting firms. I've only mentioned, Arthur D. Little. When we started to work here, Stanford Research Institute had also been doing studies here. I think they came here in the 1960s. We didn't open an office until the mid-1980s. But shortly after we opened an office, McKinsey opened an office here in Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture, was here in the mid-1980s. Now there are dozens of consulting firms, both domestic and international. But during the early period that I'm talking about, there were very few. And most of them were, stationed overseas. And so on. I've already mentioned many of the institutions and policies, but another one that I think is worth mentioning is the government's planning activities, which were started by CUSA, the Council on U.S. Aid, back from the 1948 to 63 period, and then supported JCRR. But very important, the U.S. involvement required planning, and I think they had the U.S. Program here really was responsible for Taiwan getting into more serious types of planning. So eventually CIECD became CEPD, the Council for Economic Planning and Development. And this organization, the Council for Economic Planning, had some really outstanding leaders, including Zhang Qinghuo, who was the first head of the CEPD, and then Yu Guohua and C.Y. Tung, Frederick Chen, Shirley Guo, Vincent Shao, and so on. These are all famous people who played an important role in heading up this planning exercise activity that Taiwan did. Again, another important factor is the public-private sector partnership. Even though Taiwan had central planning, which played an important economic role, and state-owned enterprises, which were critical to Taiwan's economy, there was a strong desire by the government to create an appropriate environment for the private sector. The government really wanted this to be a partnership between public and private, not state-owned. The government the public sector played a major role at first, but they're constantly were looking to engage the private sector. And those partnerships became very critical to Taiwan's success. And many of the policies that I've mentioned were in support of that. And many new institutions were founded to support that, IDIC and IDB. And also I should mention that an important component of the public-private sector were the private sector entrepreneurs who were very, very innovative and willing to take risks and dedication and make sacrifices for entrusting the government. So there was a lot of private entrepreneurship that worked with the government and felt comfortable in investing here and were very successful. I've mentioned a lot of the initiatives already that the government took when I provided the different stages of the miracle. But what was important with all of these initiatives is that they were carefully studied and evaluated. They did studies to identify opportunities and then feasibility studies with strategies. So these were projects that were undertaken with careful study behind them. So most of them were successful. Not all of them, but most of them. Many more than in other countries. So the impact of these initiatives was important because they were well studied and well funded. And finally, another important factor comes under the heading of capital inflow from foreign capital, of capital and technology. And I've been mentioning that all along. So what are the implications for the future? Well, based on all these initiatives, you might say, well, what does this mean for the future? And what can we take away from this as to what we should do? Well, you're not the politicians here, and you're not necessarily up to the level of being the major decision makers, but you can influence them. You can influence them by identifying who they are and whether they can understand some of these principles. And the first one is to build on the favorable factors that Taiwan's success that we've just discussed. So take what Taiwan has done and accomplished and build on those things. Try to recognize Taiwan's strengths look where they have failed and try and correct those. So it's very important to consider what has led to Taiwan to be in this position now and to build on those. And try to minimize the blockage of decision makers that's due to unproductive opposition, mainly political opposition. How to do that is difficult, but the dialogue between the opposing forces needs to be undertaken and resolutions, compromises reached. Elevate and recognize strong, experienced, well-trained, capable, and dedicated leaders to enable them to be decisive. So recognize who the leaders are today and reward them. Make sure that they have a voice, even if those outstanding people who are have technical backgrounds and so on are not necessarily in politics, but engage them. Continue to assign importance to undertake and execute the sound national plans. I know that there is a planning agency that does do planning, but my impression is that it's not as strong and effective as the planning exercises were in the earlier years, and people are afraid that it's giving government too much influence if they issue these plans. So the government has been, I think, from what I can tell, more tentative in terms of identifying what should be done and assisting in these initiatives. Direct a greater balance among the sectors and industries, less dependence on cyclical and highly competitive industries like electronics and chips, and more attention to promising sectors in which Taiwan has strengths in global competitiveness, like health related. Last year when I was here, I tried to get people in Taiwan interested in building on its successful record in dealing initially with COVID, and Taiwan should develop industries around this capability. It was very difficult to get people interested in it. Everyone thought it was a good idea, but they were either too busy or the government really did not feel it had the influence to help in this. So those kind of things need to be elevated. Engage experts. Again, Taiwan is small. It can't do everything, and it's behind in some things, ahead in other things. There's nothing wrong in bringing in experts in planning and execution of government initiatives. And continue strengthening the public-private sector partnership with government identifying the goals and targets that have high national interest in creating appropriate environment for encouraging and supporting the private sector and foreign investment. And now, before I close, I want to just throw out an idea for the future that you all might be interested in. I think an interesting idea is for Yale alumni to consider promoting the idea of a Taiwan Socioeconomic Center at Yale University, focusing on the following, focusing on things like the study of Taiwan's socioeconomic history, the things that we're talking about now, which are very critical. They're critical to enhance Taiwan's global brand and let the world know what's happened, to inform the people who haven't lived through this, to understand, to do some of more work in maintaining this economic history. And then to research and study Taiwan's current and future economic challenges and identify opportunities in planning in a global setting. So looking forward and continuing along the trail, doing it as a center, and maybe a possible platform for addressing and sharing issues that concern not just Taiwan, but China. Not political issues, but economic and technical issues. These activities could be under the activities that the center would do could include maintaining a library of books and publications, reports, documents, etc., sponsoring fellowships and relevant work by experts and scholars, and conducting courses, forums, and seminars. So anyway, this is, I think I've probably exceeded the time. I hope I didn't exceed or lose your interest, but this is a difficult subject to cover in such a short time. So I'm open for discussion.
Any questions? An amazing review of a 70-year journey.
Yeah.
That transformed a place which the CIA called untenable. That was the word, untenable. When 50 years after declassification, which is around 20 years ago, it became known that the CIA had come in for a review of the situation and said, completely untenable. It's like hopeless. The names you mentioned, the programs, the institutions from zero.
Right.
It can be done. There are governments doing this every day. In every department, you look at Singapore. The 7 factors you talked about, they had nothing. They had a location, they had people, and it's a management miracle. This is a management miracle. Tom Gold was right calling it that.
And a lot of these things are still required, these factors are still required in dealing with the future. If the future is, can be considered a miracle, because the consequences could be very serious, not just a tapering off, but very negative too. So these are very important factors. Whether they're the right ones or not, I don't know.
But when you look at the 7 factors, that they were all challenges. They're all challenges now. There may be, of the 7, 5 of them are almost untenable when you look at them now in our conditions. Yet we know it can happen. Energy, power, green power, nuclear power, water, infrastructure, public-private partnership, confidence of the private sector in the government, the trust, the work, you have so many different stakeholders involved, feeding into a common convergence process. Do we have convergence now? Hard to imagine.
You mentioned the word trust. That's very important. During this period, there was trust. People did not, say, oh, they're just doing this for political purpose or financial gain that they would get from it or anything. There was trust. There was trust in the government, and there was trust in the relationship between government and private sector. So trust is very critical. Trust is important in partnerships. And partnerships have to play an important role here. Partnerships between public and private, partnerships between companies, partnerships between Taiwan and the other countries in the region and in the world. They're all based on trust. How do you build trust? It's hard to say.
You write your own dissertation.
Yeah.
Please.
Here is success stories and the key success factors. That's wonderful. But was there frustration when you work out this project as an outside consultant?
Interesting. Yeah, frustrations. Well, actually, one of the frustrations was that and you as having been a consultant yourself, know, in that period, consultants were not really trusted. Because the people would say, who are you to tell us what to do? You not only aren't you a part of our organization, but you're not even Taiwanese, so not only did they not trust the concept of consulting, but they didn't trust foreigners coming in. And so it was very difficult to build that trust. And we had to do it by being understanding what perhaps some of the reasons were they weren't sure about trusting us, and try to overcome that. And there were cultural differences too, that we had to learn the cultural differences so that we could gain the trust. So, that was being as a consultant, it was difficult to build the trust at first, which we eventually did. And what other, and quite honestly, this is probably not so true today, but working in Taiwan in the 70s was challenging. Taiwan was not a very easy place to get around. It was, it was a little bit scruffy in those days.
Yes.
And bringing foreign consultants in here was difficult, a challenge too, because after they came to Taiwan the first time, many of them didn't want to come back. They didn't know the language. They couldn't put up with the motor scooters on the sidewalks and the potholes and the smell and all these things. It was very difficult, and a long trip and being away, because in those days, consultants came not just for a week and went back. They would come for 6 weeks and stay here. So that was a challenge too, but we overcame that. And as a matter of fact, in overcoming that, we built their trust. They began trusting us. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Do you know what the original statement of purpose that the government gave to RP said? Like, what were the variables they asked you to maximize or minimize that statement of purpose?
I think the main thing that they were looking for was identifying opportunities for them to shift their product mix into more value-added goods. How to be more productive and increase the value added of their small labor force. To which industries were the high priority industries, and what should they do to attract those industries? What do they have to do in terms of training people and research and financing and so on? So that was our major. That's why we brought out industry experts. They were not necessarily, planners per se. They were real engineers who worked in these industries that Taiwan was looking into, and could identify competitive factors that were necessary to make those industries succeed.
Out of the 7 factors that you talked about, for future purposes, which one do you think, in your opinion, is most critical? Public, private, government, where do you think where you put your money on?
Oh, well, they're all important, but I think it has to start with the one that I said, that you cannot tie these things to political decisions. You cannot be constrained by politics. The decision makers cannot be thinking, am I going to be reelected on this? And what do my party members think? And what do the local people, are they going to vote for me? And, too many decisions are based on the political considerations. And unless that is lessened, you can't remove it, because it is a democracy and quite successful. But the people who get elected need to be ones who say, this is what I believe, and if I have to make a decision, I'm going to make it in the best interests of Taiwan, not in the best interests of my political party. I mean, we face the same problem in all over the world, in America, in France, you know. The world has become very political. And there are countries and governments that are run by authoritarians, but most of them are not benevolent. Lee Kuan Yew was a benevolent authoritarian, but it's hard to find those people. So now we have to look for ways to convince, to vote for people who recognize that politics cannot be the leading factor. So I think that's the most important impediment, because these other things, I think, you know, can be more easily handled. So I would put that as the first thing to try and overcome that situation.
Albert.
I think maybe, you know, now that I've gone on a little bit more in years and watched politics, just to say in the United States, the idea of a benevolent leader, maybe I was more idealistic earlier that could actually be the case. And you've mentioned a few times that the leaders have been benevolent. I wonder, when we look at the United States, we find that many of our Congress people have investments and a lot of the things that they're working on. I just question, I wonder, sure, they were benefiting Taiwan, but did you notice, were they also benefiting in their own investments, in their own, I know this might be a political question, and I don't know any of the politicians listed here, but I'm just curious on your end.
I mean, I may be naive, and I was probably even more naive back then because I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I started this, and you know, this journey, got involved in it, and I was overwhelmed by their frankness, their openness, their honesty, their technical orientation. They were technocrats. I don't think any of them made very much money. As a matter of fact, this is, I was thinking I was going to mention this in my talk. Back in the 70s, when I was working down in the government center near the presidential palace, that's where all the government offices were at the time. The ministers had cars and drivers, but many of the high-level ministers or vice ministers and so on came to work on a bicycle. They rode their bicycles in those days. There weren't that many motor scooters in the early 70s. Pedicabs, but people rode their bicycle. No one had very much money. So whether they benefited from this financially, I really doubt it. What other benefits were they looking for? I don't know. I don't, these were not, I didn't get the impression that they had any interest, financial or otherwise, other than Taiwan getting on track.
Thank you.
Would you?
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Of course, you weren't here in the 70s.
I was a visitor, but I agree. I mean, I think I met Gus Reynes, I met Beijing Han.
Right.
I met KT Lee through you, actually. I mean, none of these were monetarily driven people.
Yeah.
And when they had things that they wanted, it was for universities, for schools, for somebody else. It was always giving to somebody else.
And in those days, they didn't have to be reelected. Now, I have to say one thing, though. If I had to really think very seriously, what other than the grandiose motivation of the economy and national interests, people were loyal to other people. There was sort of a respect or loyalty. So you didn't say to somebody who was your senior or someone that you don't agree with them. So there was a little bit of that kind of constraint in terms of relationships. So relationship is very valuable to the Chinese culture. It was in those days. So sometimes you didn't know whether someone was saying something because they really believed it or they didn't want to contradict someone else, or they knew that someone who they found important felt this too, and they didn't, and they had to support them. So there was a little bit of that, but it was not motivated by any other things.
You know, and one thing I think that today's Taiwan, the gap, the contrast between being foreign and being local. When you look at the crowd in this room, many people are Taiwanese who were schooled overseas and have come back. So are you local or are you foreign? You're both. And so some of those cultural things are ameliorated today, or could be. I wish and hope that more people will learn from these lessons, these 7 factors. We have recorded this and we will share this. I urge Professor Reinfeld to think about, you've got the outline for the book. This is a very, very important story, especially this last part, but how it applies to the future and how it applies to today. Those 7 factors we should think about more. I'd like.
Well, let me ask you all a question. Does anybody think that I left out something important, or that wants to identify something that is even more important than I seem to have stressed? Any additions or modifications in what I've said?
I'd like people to give a round of applause. For being able to articulate this story and tell it, and preserve it, and to analyze it for us, and also for his lifetime of dedication for Taiwan. Not only him, but all the people that he mentioned and the countless others who didn't actually get named, of which there are many. You know, I've always respected you for many reasons, and I respect you even more. I mean, you really are a Jedi.